This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo. This time, the third installment of my visit to Helioscope Studio in Portland. We'll hear from the manager, a comics artist in his own right, Steve Lieber, with a brief history of the studio, including its difficulties with naming itself, joining Helioscope and the advantages of being a member, and tips on starting your own studio. Then the studio's summer intern, Maria Frantz, talks about being inspired by Calvin and Hobbes and tells us about her work. Finally, in perhaps the best interview of my entire summer trip around the U.S., Ben Dewey gives us a look into his process. The day I was there, he had just received some beautiful color proofs of his work on Dark Horse's title Beasts of Burden, which became the touchstone for a lot of talk about how he makes comics. He's also worked on Kurt Busiek's Autumnlands title, and he talks about that and what was good about Rob Liefeld's work. Steve Lieber in a moment. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week. We really appreciate your support. Okay, I'm talking with Steve Lieber, who is manager, honcho, something of Helioscope. How are you doing?
Doing well, yeah. I'm trying to get everyone to call me Khaleesi, but it's just not working out.
Khaleesi, I don't know this word.
It's from Game of Thrones.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, now, I know this studio used to be called Periscope?
Yep, we were initially called Mercury.
Oh.
And about a month after we decided on that name, the Portland Mercury got citywide distribution, rendering us invisible to Google.
So, what's the Portland Mercury?
The Portland Mercury is a local giveaway newspaper.
Okay.
Every edition of which has both illustration and cartooning in it. So they're going to have a really, really big online footprint, and we had a much smaller one, so we were just invisible. It took us a while to pick a new name. We eventually settled on Periscope, and we were very happy with that name for years. And then the video app Periscope showed up, at every band in the world would use the automatic feed live from the studio Periscope. And rendering us invisible to both Google and Twitter. We're live on Periscope Studio session with, and so we just disappeared. And there's an advertising agency by that name, and they didn't want us to be causing any confusion. So we reached through our dictionaries for another name, and we wound up with Helioscope, which is a name we're really happy with.
What does it mean, helioscope?
A helioscope is a device for projecting an image of the sun onto paper.
Okay.
Yeah, which is a lot closer to what we do than sticking a telescope out of the water.
And how long have you been Helioscope?
Just about a year.
Okay. Yeah, I encountered you as Periscope when I went to Emerald City in 2011.
Okay.
And I think Natalie Norgat was in here at that time.
Yep.
Yeah. Now, were you involved from the beginning? Did you start?
Yeah,
this?
I was one of the founders, one of the first 11 folks here.
And this was what year?
That was 2002.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, spring of 2002. So we're 15 years old at this point. We started off. We all had a bunch of friends who made comics here in town, and we were getting together for coffee and talking shop and showing each other what we were doing, and we realized that if we can get together on a regular basis to draw at a coffee shop, we could probably split some office space. And we held a few meetings to figure out what can everybody afford, what kind of space do we want, where does everybody live, so what's at least equally inconvenient for everybody, and downtown very quickly became clear was the right place for that, because a lot of folks use public transportation, and this way buses come straight here from everywhere in the city. We found a building a few blocks from where we are right now. That was very quickly condemned. Wasn't our fault.
They're artists now. We're going to condemn it.
There was also a band having practice space in there, and some junkies leaving needles in the bathroom. I'm glad to be out of that building. Moving here was a pretty good move, and we've been in this building since 2003.
Okay. So now, like, if somebody wants to join, then what do they need to do?
Well,
are there some requirements to qualify, or?
For the most part, we'll have, if you're a candidate to join, we've probably already heard of you and have contacted you about it. But for new artists who've moved to town, or folks with established professional careers who are interested in reaching out to us, we've got an email link at our website, and they can talk to me, and we can figure out if it's a good match.
And it's helioscopepdx.com, right?
Helioscopepdx.com.
I found helioscope.com as something else.
There's the only other business that we could find called Helioscope is a business that sells software for managing solar panel arrays, I believe. And I only know that because we get one or two angry emails every month from people whose solar panel arrays are encountering trouble. They want to know what I'm going to do about it.
We could draw you a comic about it.
I'm going to draw a sad Hulk for you, is what I'm going to
do. Okay. Well, and so do all the members come here and work, or do some just kind of pop in now and then?
For some, it's very occasional. Some, it's every day. We've got a few members who are probably here 7 days a week, with very little interest in a life beyond their work. Some are 5 day a week, some 3 days a week, some just a couple of days a month, and some maintain membership even though they don't come in much at all, because there's other benefits to being part of the group.
Yeah, right. Like some were telling me about being able to use kind of expensive equipment that the studio is invested in. Exactly,
and we tend to get very good placement at comic book conventions and things like that. And our in-house email list is full of interesting jobs passing back and forth and things like that. That's been a big advantage for a lot of folks in the studio, is the ability to help each other out on things. What everybody found is that when you have other artists around who can help out in a pinch, deadline troubles tend to go away. I've got to get 3 pages done tonight. Hey, can you help me out with some backgrounds? Yeah, no problem. Boom. There's generally somebody around who can help you out. For those of us who shoot photo reference, it's tremendously useful having somebody in the room who knows how to pose for a comic book panel. What would be a good pose for a movie still would be terrible for a comic, and vice versa. The gestures need to be wildly exaggerated. Same for expressions. Things that would look really, really foolish in a photograph of a person look completely natural when converted to line art.
Interesting.
Okay.
So if they, I don't know if you want to say what the fee is or not, what the amount is, but
it varies. We've got a sliding scale for what people can afford. And there's different levels of membership. Some levels of membership come with a desk space of your own, and other people just pay what we call float rates. They get a key to the room, access to the space 24/7,
but not their own desk.
And not their own desk. They'll just take an empty desk and use that and use whatever's available. we've set the rates up. Officially, we're a business. We're an LLC, but we're not. Even though we're not a nonprofit, because that's a huge headache in form filing and bookkeeping and such. But we don't really operate with making a profit off of our members as a goal. The studio exists to make life easier for the cartoonists here, not to earn a profit off of renting space to cartoonists.
I see. And are there other studios like this in town?
Oh yeah, there's Tranquility Base just a few blocks away. They're 5 or 6 blocks, and they've got some terrific folks there. There's another one in southeast Portland. I can never remember the name of it, but it's another shared workspace with a bunch of cartoonists in there, including Barry Deutsch, who does the Merca series, young adult comics, and I think there's a couple of other, like 2 or 3 person studios around, just a couple of close friends splitting a space. Cartoonists have been doing this for a long time. Wally Wood said that choosing a career making comics is like taking a life sentence at hard labor in solitary. And at least this way, we're getting back into the general population. I mean, they punish prisoners by putting them in solitary. Whereas,
well, yeah, it's a very solitary occupation. Drawing comics.
But you're working this way. Even if you're there with headphones, there's a buzz of other people in the room. You can pop your head up if you have a question about whether something's working. There's somebody with an educated eye sitting 3 feet away.
Right. It's not your mom saying, "Oh, it's very nice, dear."
Yeah. My mom would have said, "That looks like garbage."
Or that. That's equally unhelpful.
Yeah. Not really. Sorry, Mom. There's just a lot of advantages of having other people around who work in the same field as you. Jobs get passed around. Someone gets called up. An ad agency wants them to do some storyboards. They don't have time, but hey, the guy sitting next to me, she has time. We've had a mentorship program running for a while. It runs on and off depending on whether someone has time to administer it or not. But at this point, we've had about 60 interns or mentees or whatever you'd call them cycle through here. Many have gone on to join the studio or gone on to work professionally in the industry. We try very hard to make it an actual valuable experience and not one of those things where, hey, you show up and you work for free for us for 3 months and then we kick you out. We try very hard to make sure that it's an actual valuable experience for them, that they get spend 3 months being exposed to what a freelance career actually looks like. I know that for myself, getting out of art school, that was maybe the scariest thing, was just not knowing how this all worked. We had some professional practices classes and such, but I know it would have been tremendously helpful for me just to have spent a week or two in the presence of other cartoonists, hearing how they talk to their editors, getting an idea of what you do if a client is paying late, how do you figure out how to price something, how do you deal with scheduling troubles. There's a million little business problems that every cartoonist has to solve, and it's nice to not have to reinvent the wheel.
Mm-hmm. So if someone lives in a town where they can't find a studio like this and they'd like to start their own, what advice would you give them?
I've written a whole essay on that. I can give you a URL that you could put at the bottom of the link. Short version is, don't start off trying to make a studio. Start off with a drink and draw or a coffee shop meeting. Get together maybe twice a month, once a month, maybe once a week if everyone's really gung-ho about it. Just see if you like working around each other, or if somebody has a terrible habit of whistling while they work that just drives you insane. But get together, at a coffee shop for a few hours every Wednesday, something like that. And once you have a sense of who would be a good candidate, figure out what kind of budget you can afford for this, and then start shopping around for inexpensive real estate. Don't go for anything on the ground floor. Go several floors up. It's a lot cheaper. Set your rents so that you're making a little bit extra, because there's always somebody who's going to be paying a little late. And if you've got a month or two of rent tucked away in advance, it'll make everything go a lot easier. You won't be constantly having to send apology notes to your landlord. Start off with the assumption that initially it's just going to be sharing space, but eventually you may start to find that when the people that you're working with, when their careers advance, your career advances as well. That's been something that we've seen a lot here. Good news for one person in the room tends to be good news for everybody, not just because we're glad to see it, but because they're getting more opportunities. Often leads to more opportunities for others around.
Because the publishers know the studio name, and so they kind of look at who else is here?
Publishers know the studio name. There's more interesting jobs to pass along. Conventions bring one of us out, find that we're a good guest, and ask, who else do you know? And suddenly they're bringing out 5 or 6 of us at a time. Opportunities tend to multiply themselves that way.
I see. Now, are you kind of managing this, like collecting the rents and all that? Is that your job?
Yeah. That's what do I do? Collect the rent. I do a lot of the social media. A lot of there was a term thrown around a lot on the internet a couple of years ago. Unpaid emotional labor. The job of just managing people and feelings and stuff like that, and that's a big part of what I do. You can call me unpaid emotional labor. A lot of things like that. I keep on top of the. We have an Etsy store and an eBay account, and so occasionally we'll put stuff up for sale there. Typically. People volunteer for what they're good at, or what they have a sense for. With any given group, there's going to be somebody who loves doing social media and is really good at it. Let them do it. They can have all the clever apps on their phone that allow them to manage 6 different social media accounts at once or something. Somebody else might be good at packing and shipping, and let them handle any kind of mail order that you do. Somebody else is good at business or outreach. They can be in charge of reaching out to commercial clients if you want to take on that sort of work in your studio. There's more than enough work for everybody. It's just a matter of who feels like taking on what.
Steve Lieber is at stevelieber.com. Okay, talking with Maria Frantz. How are you?
Doing pretty good, yeah.
Now, so you're an intern here,
yes,
is that right?
Sort of an intern mentee sort of situation.
Mentee, okay,
yeah.
You're being mentored.
Yeah. I've basically been here all summer, and I've been coming in pretty much every weekday to just work on my own projects and then get advice from them. And in exchange, I'll occasionally go ship some packages or get coffee or something like that. But it's mostly just me coming in to work on my own work and then getting advice from the people at the studio when I can.
Okay, so you've just been here like the past 2-3 months then?
Yeah, pretty much all summer.
Okay, how old are you?
20.
20.
I'm going to turn 21 in October.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you like a college student? Or?
Yes,
Okay.
I'm going to be a junior next year.
Okay, where are you going?
PNCA, Pacific Northwest College of Art.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's right here in Portland then,
Yeah,
right?
it's like
okay.
10 blocks down the street, yeah.
Okay. And so what kind of comics are you working on?
Most of the comics I work on are fantasy or fiction in some form, and they tend to focus around strong female protagonists. I've got this continual world that I'm sort of building called Fend, and I'm trying to make a series of comics that sort of explore that world, and I'm trying to use that fictional environment to explore like real world issues and real world problems. Yeah.
Okay. Or is this a webcomic? Is it getting published on paper?
Yeah,
How are you doing this?
I mean, up until now, it's been a series of short stories, but just recently I'm making like a full-length graphic novel that's going to be probably 60 to 70 pages that explores sort of the justifications of violence or lack thereof, depending on who you ask. And I was trying to use that fictional world to sort of explore that topic.
I see. So have you ever done like a webcomic? Is there something online that people can look at?
Yeah, I have my website, which is mariafrantz.net, and then I also did a webcomic when I was in high school. It was a very long time ago. It's not.
Seems long ago to you.
Yeah.
Wait till you're my age.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. And that ended up being about 75 pages, and it was called Blue Street. If you want to look at it, it's bluestreetcomic.com. Personally, I don't really like reading it anymore because it was a long time ago. My skill level was very different.
Yeah,
but,
I know what you mean. You look at stuff. I imagine if I listened to early episodes of this podcast, I kind of wince.
Yeah. But it was still. I didn't end up. I got to 75 pages, but I still was really glad that I did it because I learned more from doing that comic and actually like committing myself to a long form project than I would have doing other sorts of things. So. Yeah.
Okay. So are you drawing all electronically?
I actually mostly draw analog traditionally, which is unusual, it seems. When I first
especially for a 20-year-old.
Yeah. Most of my friends just draw digitally, and I feel like most of the people actually in the studio I'm working at draw digitally. But just for me personally, I still color digitally, but as far as ink work and getting the actual comic down, there's something about just using a brush and ink that I can't replicate through any sort of digital means. So yeah.
Interesting. So, like, what comics have influenced you? Any particular creators or titles or something that you
There's
feel...
so many. There's, like, probably actually literally hundreds. But when I was a kid, I was really influenced by Calvin and Hobbes. That was, like, the thing that got me first interested in comics, I think. That's what made me start drawing little comics in elementary school. There's something about seeing an adult kind of capture these feelings that I was feeling as a kid so accurately. It's things that I couldn't even put my finger on. It made me want to try to do that for other people too.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I'd heard somebody else brought up earlier in my trip that they were kind of surprised at how, like, kids who were reading comics after Calvin and Hobbes stopped, after Bill Watterson stopped putting it out, who were kind of drawn into comics by Calvin and Hobbes. And I think people who read it as adults kind of see it as a comic for adults because there's a lot in it for adults. But it's kind of like the 60s Batman TV show that works at different levels. Or The Simpsons or something, where there's something that appeals to kids and something else that appeals to adults.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I mean, I haven't seen your work, but do you feel like is drawing anything in particular from Calvin and Hobbes in the art style or the story? Or
art style and story, probably not at this point. What most got me about that was just the emotion tied to it, I think, in Calvin and Hobbes. And that's more what I was drawing on. That's more what I wanted to do when I read that.
Kind of the feel of
there
it.
There is definitely sort of like the same whimsical thing. Like, Calvin tends to, explore a lot of fictional worlds in his own comics. So, and I definitely integrate a lot of that. But yeah. And these days, I guess a lot of what inspires me are just little comics that I find aren't necessarily mainstream that most people might not know about, or at least people outside of my generation might not. I read a webcomic called Ava's Demon a lot.
What's it called?
Ava's Demon.
Ava's Demon.
Yeah,
okay.
It's this comic basically. It's like a space opera sort of comic, where all these people get attached to these like ghosts, I guess, or aliens that have attached themselves to another living organism to basically fulfill some wish that they couldn't fulfill when they were alive. And a lot of the art style, a lot of the story from that has influenced me. Kate Beaton is another one. I really like the facial expressions she has and just the humor that she has. I've been trying to put that in my work for a while.
She has a really kind of deceptively simple style. I mean, it's complex, but it doesn't look like it is.
Yeah, and she can communicate a lot of emotion just in one face, and just the right. She has just the right style for the kind of comic she's making. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I haven't talked to many creators as young as you. I'm wondering, what's your kind of perspective on comics? I mean, people of my generation kind of got the idea, comics sort of equaled superhero comics plus whatever was in the newspaper. We've got a couple of books of 50s Peanuts here on the table.
Yeah.
But I mean, it seems like the younger people, in their 20s, there are so many people who are making comics nowadays, and they're not superhero comics, and they might be memoir comics, or they might be fiction, or they might be comics journalism.
Yeah.
I mean, it sort of feels like your generation is much more kind of embraced comics as a way of expressing themselves than maybe my generation did. Does that feel right to you?
Yeah, I feel like it's been embraced less as a genre and more as a medium, if that makes sense. Because I feel like, it was kind of restricted to newspaper comics and superhero comics, and now, especially with the use of the internet, people can make comics about whatever. And that's most of the comics I feel like people in my generation are reading these days are people that just made a comic and put it online, even if it's a short comic or a long comic. And that's kind of enabled us to play with the medium a lot more and sort of break out of those molds that have been there for decades.
Right, yeah. Well, just like everything else, the internet democratized comics, too.
Absolutely, yeah.
Maria Frantz is at mariafrantz.net. That's Frantz. Coming up, Ben Dewey on receiving and correcting his color proofs for Beasts of Burden, and more. On our Patreon page, I've just released some photos of Helioscope Studio, viewable by our patrons giving at any amount. Also, because of the Patreon goal we reached, last week I released vintage episode number 113 from February 4th, 2008, an interview with Alex Robinson, whose graphic novel Tricked had greatly expanded my take on what comics could do. This week I'll be releasing episode 112, my first interview with Matt Sility, in which we discuss his graphic novel The Homeless Channel. Watch for it at the end of your podcast feed, on our Facebook page, or at patreon.com/deconcomics, where you can pledge a monthly amount to keep the show going and unlock more vintage episodes. The Patreon goal we hit unlocked episodes back to number 101, so for the next 11 weeks I'll keep releasing vintage episodes at one per week. You can help unlock more vintage episodes by making a pledge. Go to patreon.com/deconcomics right now and pledge at least $3 a month. We really appreciate your support.
Are you willing to follow me on a journey and risk getting lost in the swirling maze of past ages, protected only by our red indestructible capes as we break through the final unexplored realm of the time barrier to explore the fantastic Silver Age adventures of the world's greatest hero, Superman? If so, join me each week on the Superman Fan Podcast, as together we'll follow the Man of Steel, his cousin Supergirl, and his closest friends, Perry White, Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, Lana Lang, Batman and Robin, and others in Superman's never-ending quest to defend truth and justice in the pages of Action Comics, Superman, World's Finest Comics, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, and Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane. Go to the supermanfanpodcast.blogspot.com, available on iTunes and most other podcast aggregators. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Medium, Flipboard, and Stitcher. And after you listen, feel free to send email to supermanfanpodcast@gmail.com And unless you request otherwise, I look forward to reading your comments on future episodes. And don't forget to wear your red indestructible cape, standard safety equipment for traveling through the time barrier.
Okay, now I'm with Benjamin Dewey. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm out of my hot studio, and and we're sitting right where I used to work, and make me reevaluate. Maybe I should come back in and work here.
Yeah, it's nice and cool in here.
Yeah.
So you just walked in with a bunch of watercolored pages. What book is this going to be?
So I got approached by Daniel Chabin from Dark Horse to work on Beasts of Burden, and I wasn't super familiar with the series beforehand, but of course you pick it up, and it's this lovely series about magic dogs painted by Jill Thompson. And it's a nice leap from what I was doing working on Autumnlands at Image, but because of some things that Kurt Busiek, the writer, has going on, I've taken on the side project just so I can make my mortgage and that he can recover and figure out how he wants to structure his working situation. And so it's been great because I still get to draw fun stuff, and all the skills that I was using on Autumnlands I have transferred over to this, and I'm doing a 4-issue run for now, and if there's more, I'll do it.
Okay, so you said painted by Jill Thompson, but she's not doing this?
No,
part,
I'm not sure what she has going on, but I kind of get the impression that they want me to do at least this one as a stopgap, maybe while she's working on more stuff. I'm not sure, and I didn't want to pry into what she has going on, because I get the impression she's working on some Wonder Woman and other stuff. She won a bunch of Eisners this year, so it's not like she's lacking for projects to do, but I assume it's somewhat like Hellboy, where Mike Mignola has got a bunch of stuff going on. He'll draw it sometimes, but then he will hand the baton off to other people that they think are a good fit. And it seems a good fit so far. I like doing it, and it's not as oppressive a work schedule as working on my own creator-owned book, which has its own joys and challenges that are fun too, but when you're working on your own book and you have to create a whole universe, that can be exhausting because every detail is up to you. But if I walk into a book where, all right, well, this is kind of how they do things, it's like performing your own one-man show versus doing a Shakespeare play. It's not that there isn't a better or worse way to do it, but there's a groundwork that's already established that you can then pick up and go from there.
So, so these pages, you drew them and put watercolor on them?
Yeah.
Okay.
So typically what I will do is I will thumbnail in a sketchbook, not maybe 4x6. So I keep my thumbnails really small because I just want to make sure that the relationships of the characters in the background and everything are legible at a tiny, diminished, abstract scale. And then when I do the digital pencils, I've scanned my thumbnails, imported them into Manga Studio, and then I do a fairly loose digital pencils compared to what other people will do. And I like to do it digitally because I'm messy on paper when I sketch. I do a lot of construction lines. And so if I'm doing digital pencils, it allows me all the freedom to be as messy as I want. I do it in 3 layers typically, a 30% layer, a 50% layer, and a 70% layer, so that I can get really messy on the bottom one, tighten it up on the 50%, and then at the end make it a lot tighter on the 70%. And then I print those out on watercolor paper. I ink them analog for a variety of reasons that mostly have to do with the way the human eye processes information. And then I watercolor, at least on this project, that's what I do. On Autumnlands, I would do the same process minus the color. I would do the washes in gray, and then I send them to the loveliest colorist in the world, Geordie Belair in Ireland, and she does magic.
I see. Now, what were you saying before about corrections, or how you don't get to do corrections on this?
Yeah. It's a little bit of a tightrope walk, right? Because if you screw up in watercolor, I guess there's little ways you can push things around or you can layer it, but not really. So it's good to have rehearsed it as many times as possible. I think it's like anything, the more you rehearse in a purposeful way, the easier it will be to nail it when it really counts, when the red light's on. And so in this case, I printed out my digital pencils and I did, I don't know what they would be, like 1/10 the size watercolor studies to make sure. And I was trying to pay attention to what I learned from Bill Crabtree, the colorist for The Sixth Gun, my friend Brian Hurt's book. And he had done a little demo where he was describing how he keys color to various scenes. And something I learned from Kurt Busiek, when you bump down a tier, that's a way of establishing a psychological return key shift for the reader. But you can also do that, you can double down on that with color. And so with this project, I tried to pay attention to, like, well, what does Jordy do? What does Dave Stewart do? What does, Bill Crabtree do? People who I know use color in a way where they are essentially providing almost the equivalent of a soundtrack for the comic. If it's muted tones, it tells you something about the moment. If it's over the top and the rendering's over the top, it's staccato violin part, like you want that kind of thought process. So I think about it a lot beforehand, and I do a lot of preparatory work. And that way, when I'm actually sitting down, it's like taping off a room to paint it in your house. It feels like a pain in the butt to do all the taping, but when you do the taping and you pull the tape off and it looks good, you've made your job way easier. So that's what I do before that. Corrections, you can do little things. If it's really egregious, you maybe could fix it in Photoshop, but I try to make sure that it is what it is, like, plug and play, kind of go in the studio, one take deal. Yeah.
And you said that you were doing it at a size that's not much bigger than the print size.
Yeah, I think, maybe 20% bigger. And part of that is just because the watercolor process is... I don't necessarily know that I paint in a way that would make a larger scale page look better. It might have some drawbacks, actually, if I were to do it really big. How you use different brushes, I don't know, I might try it in the future, but with this one, I wanted to see how fast I could do it if I did it at just slightly larger than print. And at this point, I can do 2 watercolor pages a day, which is pretty good. And that way, like, nobody has to wait. I make better money. I get to spend time with my wife, play my guitars, pet my cats, all that stuff. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and it looks great.
Oh,
so
thanks.
I think that's working out. Now, do you know when this issue is going to come out?
I'm not sure. I don't know if they want to do a monthly schedule or how solicits work at Dark Horse, but I'll finish this issue today. Like, after this interview, I'll go home and I'll finish that last page, and then I'll probably do whatever final checkovers I want. I might use some Prismacolor pencils to bump up some effects and stuff like that. And occasionally I'll like to do a thing where I'll double down on line weight to pull things forward or push things back. Or both, I guess, and then I'll scan them all and send them on off to my editor and see what he says. But at this point, he's seen all the stuff at every stage, and like I said, there's a bunch of stages, and so I imagine, barring any crazy thing that I can't imagine at this point and anticipate, that it'll be okay, and then it'll probably be 2 weeks until it's ready. And their turnaround is, from what I can tell, pretty fast. But it may be a thing where they want me to do all the issues, or at least 2 or 3, and then have them in the can so that when they announce it, there's no delay. And how comics are. Yeah. It's like sometimes stuff happens, or a person gets sick, or they hurt their wrist, or whatever, and then all of a sudden or they get all Howard Hughes about stuff and they can't finish. Because they get overly meticulous, Axl Rose on Chinese Democracy. It's like, I try not to do that. My friend Terry, who works right to the right of where we're sitting, he taught a class, and that was one of the things he had me come in and talk to his students. And I told him, like, if you want to succeed in comics, you can't be precious until you have a track record of success, and then you can be precious, and then people don't seem to mind. But on your way up, you really have to. I mean, and I wouldn't, because I get bummed out when there are artists that I like, whether in music or film or anything else, where you can tell their tendency to lean into their own quirks has made it impossible for them to turn out things with any regularity. And so my preference is to do what is satisfying, not what is the summation of every possible ideal choice. Because comics is in part about compromise. You compromise when you're laying out a page. Not every page or every panel is going to be some mind-blowing revelation of your talent. It's just your job is to be a storyteller, right? And it's like in some instances you get to draw something super badass and people's minds are blown. And then other instances you're just doing the yeoman's work of, here's a guy holding a cup, and there's no way to draw that flashy, and if you drew it flashy, you're doing it wrong. So I feel like there's a balance to strike between getting fancy with the stuff that you do, and if you set certain limitations on yourself, it'll prevent you from going down that Byzantine rabbit hole, or Baroque bananas over the top stuff that keeps people from turning stuff out on time. So I'm trying to do my best to help them put it out at whatever schedule they want to put it out at.
Okay. Now, a few minutes ago you mentioned Prismacolor pens. What are those?
So Prismacolor color pencils. So I like them because they're, I don't know the best way to describe it. It's sort of like a waxy but thick. They're a lush color pencil. And I like them as a... I'm not sure if Drew Struzan, the famous poster artist, if he used those or not, but they can be really tight and precise, but they're also the kind of thing that's going to lay down a nice thick color line of any weight you're capable of putting in place. And those can be nice if you're working on, say, gouache surface, or depending on how you put down acrylic, they can go over the top of that. They're pretty all-terrain pencil. Yeah. So, I like to use those for After Effects as a little tweak.
Now, you mentioned you had a creator-owned project. What is that?
Yeah, I work on a book called Autumnlands for Image Comics with Kurt Busiek, the writer of Astro City and Marvels and a bunch of other things.
Okay, so he's writing and you're drawing.
That's right. And then Jordi Belair is a colorist, and J.G. Rochelle is the letterer.
Now, what's that book about?
It's a book about a magical, anthropomorphic future society that is running out of its chief resource. And so they decide to bring back what they perceive to be this savior figure. And I used to tell Kurt, I was like, when I'll give people my elevator pitch, it's they wanted a Jesus, but they got the Terminator. And in typical Kurt fashion, he quickly transmogrified that into they wanted a savior, but they got a soldier. And so they just bring this guy who's like, Hicks. No, what's his name? I think it's Hicks from Terminator, who he's just a guy, and he doesn't know why John Connor sends him back in time, but there's all this destiny and whatever else. And so our main character, Leroy, he's at a specific place in time in history when magic enters the world, and they just grab him from this time, and he doesn't know why he's there, and they don't know why he's there, but it has larger implications for the future of this world that is now populated by slightly morphed animals. So they're humanoid of varying sizes and varying degrees of anthropomorphism, and so it's sword and sorcery mixed with some high-tech things, because he's a soldier from our future and from their past.
Our future and their past. Okay.
Yeah. So he's got, I in the character design, I designed things like when you open your iPhone, you might trace out a shape on the screen. So on his forearms, he has these tattoos that are a circle on the top of his palm going back into an arrow, so that if you wanted to go clockwise or counterclockwise and then run down the stripe and then do a thing, it would unlock various biotech abilities that are inside of his body. And Kurt's suggestion was, well, why don't we have him tap where you would have glasses, and these holographic lenses will appear. And essentially he's got all of human knowledge in his head, but he has to know to look for it. He doesn't know it automatically. He has to be able to look it up and then enact it. So and it doesn't always work. It's partially functional, we find out in the first couple of issues, because he flexes his hand and sparks start shooting out of his tattoos, so it's not 100%.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kurt Busiek keeps himself busy, doesn't he?
Yeah,
Astro City too.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing, is like he's an amazing writer, but I also think that it's hard for any creative to not do a lot of the things they want to do, and sometimes that creates compromises in the workflow part of it. And I think, I don't necessarily want to say too much about his circumstance, but he's a busy guy, and at the moment, and he's been saying to people on Twitter who've asked that he's got some health things going on.
Yeah, I'd heard that too.
That make it hard for him to do all of the work he wants to do. And so, I can appreciate that. After you work 8-12 hours a day on a comics book page, the last thing you want to do is another project, and that's in part why I think writers and colorists, at least in the contemporary climate, are often better known than most of the just regular workaday artists, because they can work on 11 or 12 books. So if your name is recurring over and over and over again, then people can attach themselves to you, and they feel like they can rely on your brand. So that it creates a certain complication for artists. So like if you want to do extra stuff, you have to put in even more time after the fact. So I'm trying to work on some all ages things and some other little fun, posters and illustration projects, and even just stuff for my own enjoyment, working in the sketchbook, trying to do the hard, unglamorous work of the comics equivalent of weightlifting, where you're just practicing torsos or women's faces or feet or something in a sketchbook. I do that after I've spent a full day at the desk, and it's exhausting. So yeah, I mean, at the moment there's some complications that are preventing us from moving forward, but there's 2 issues in the can, and whenever Kurt feels up to it, I've told him I'm ready to do it, but we just have to adjust the way that we work going forward, because part of the reason I took on Beasts of Burden was because I couldn't count on when I was going to get script, and we had just bought a house. And so when you buy a house and then you're a freelancer and you don't know where the money's going to come from, in some cases it's like you have to make a leap sometimes. And no offense to anybody else you're working with, you get to a point where I don't want that to be his responsibility. It's not his responsibility to provide me with work. It's my responsibility to determine what my circumstance is and be as pragmatic as possible. And once I realized that, I was like, oh, okay, I feel way less pressure. I feel much more calm, because now the focal point isn't when is Kirk going to get me a script. It's what am I doing to make my life function the best way I can, and how do I make sure my collaborator doesn't feel extra pressure, and that if he is having these complications, how do I ease the burden on him but still let him know I'm ready whenever he is. And I feel like we've reached a good place at this point. Like the stuff that he's working on, the obligations he has, I told him, just work on that stuff, get to a point where you feel better. You do that, and in the meantime, I'll work on Beasts of Burden and these other projects I want to do. So it's at this point, it's a fairly comfortable circumstance, at least for me, and I'm open to whatever the future brings.
Yeah, we're just waiting on somebody else can drive you crazy.
It can.
I've been in that situation myself.
Yeah, and I think it's not as like if you get to the point where you start to get frustrated and like, well, why aren't they giving me this thing? And it's like, well, life and creativity and the process of working on these things is not easy, and stuff comes up, and human bodies are what they are, and you have to make allowances for that. And I like that comics is the kind of thing where there's not so much money on the line where you're going to have studio executives breathing down your neck and demanding things from him, making him, push his body to the limit, or me push mine to the limit. Even so, there are comic book artists I know who are wearing braces and, self-medicating with whatever, coffee or, things to make them concentrate. And it's like, once you step back and you realize, like, you don't have to do that. There's a point maybe when you're breaking in where those things are part of the process potentially, but it's not an absolute. And Steve, at one point, Steve Lieber, I was telling him how frustrated I was with the process of drawing and how complicated these pages were. And I was like, man, I'm spending 12 hours at the table. It's driving me crazy. And he's like, well, the first 8 hours, that makes sense, but the next 4 is on you. And I was like, it's hard to hear, but that's right. If you don't work on your efficiency, if you don't think about ways to communicate clearly, then you're going to run into the situation where you are putting more time than is necessary into panels people are going to read for just a few seconds. And minus being, Jeff Darrow or Barry Windsor Smith or something, and you have the time or you've built up that clout where you can take however long you want to, your job is to be reliable and turn this thing around for people. And I don't know, after looking at people read my comics or watching how I read comics, I'm like, oh, Goran Parlov has it figured out. Just straightforward, no nonsense, no messing around. Here is what you're looking at. It's an ongoing struggle, but it's something I work on all the time.
Now, are you from this area, Portland?
No, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and I moved out here 12 years ago, and now I live down in Milwaukee, so a stone's throw from
which is part of Portland.
Yeah, right.
We're not talking about Wisconsin.
No, it's true. It's fairly close. It's a slightly different vibe in that it feels sleepier and more Mayberry in some ways, and then more Trailer Park Boys and others. It's a weird mishmash of things. But I like our little house, and I like having my own backyard studio in progress. And so coming into Portland and trying to live here, I couldn't afford my house in Portland, so that's one material way in which it's different. But I could afford a house in Milwaukee, and I like our neighbors, and it's great.
Okay. How long have you been a member of this studio?
So I joined in 2009, and then when we bought our house, I took a emeritus position, or I took a leave, depending how you look at it, because I just couldn't afford to pay the dues. And so I guess I'm like a phantom member. Like, I'm not listed on the site, but I table with them.
Okay. Yeah, so I Googled a little bit and I looked at your blog, so I was like, okay.
Yeah, when I first started as an intern here in, I was like late 2008, early 2009, I kept a record, more or less, of what I was experiencing. And then my friend Ben Bates, who right now draws for, I think he draws for Marvel Animation, he said the blog was really helpful to him because then he knew what to expect coming in, and he came in shortly after me, and now he draws at Marvel Animation, and he's buddies with Dustin Weaver, and they've worked on stuff together, and he's amazing draftsman. He's got brilliant ideas as an artist, for sure.
What kind of comics did you read growing up?
The stuff I loved the most was, in terms of comic books, like actual floppies, I think the first thing I bought was a Ninja Turtles fully collected black and white omnibus. I had my dad drive me 40 minutes across town to this comic shop that had it, and I just remember it being like a dungeon or someone's garage. That's what it felt like. It didn't feel welcoming at all. And I asked this guy for Ninja Turtles, and this was before the show, and I forget how I heard about it. I think I saw the show was going to come out, and I saw some toy, and I was like, what is that? And I walked into the shop, and the guy had this big collection, and it blew my mind. And there was this story where there's a guy who can draw things that then come to life in some way. And at the time, I was like, man, what a cool aesthetic. This is so neat. How did this guy figure this out? And I really, he's riffing on Jack Kirby. Whoever was drawing it was trying to do this whole thing where all these Kirby monsters were being created by this guy. And then he ends up having to fight them. And at least I remember that. And then, so like that was a comic that I cared about a lot. And then not too long after that, I remember walking into this shop up the street from where my mom lived, because we used to go eat at this place called Jean's Place in Cleveland. That it's a 1930s and 40s themed restaurant. And right next door, there's a comic shop called Carol and John's, and they had that gatefold. I think that's the term for it. The big unfolding X-Men cover by Jim Lee. I had never seen something so amazing in my life, and like that thing in movies where the world just becomes a tunnel and it all melts away except for that. It's like, this person's the best artist who ever lived. And like, I didn't understand how comics were made. I didn't know there was a colorist and an inker and all this other stuff. But yeah, I got that, and then all my friends and I were collecting these Marvel trading cards, and so I would get whatever comics I could get. Occasionally, I'd beg my dad for a Conan from the grocery store or whatever you could find in those racks, because comic shops were kind of far afield. And at the time, the late 80s, early 90s. It wasn't like they were on spinning racks. And I was not an Archie kid for whatever reason. That was never something. I was like, I wanted monsters, and I wanted spaceships, and I wanted lasers, and all that cool stuff. And I bought that X-Men run for a long time. I bought Rob Liefeld's, what was it? Not X-Force, maybe? Or something like that. I would buy all the stuff that people now complain about as being not good comics. But it's a funny thing, like Dustin Weaver, who I just mentioned earlier, he said this thing about Rob Liefeld that I thought was brilliant. He said people will criticize him for his anatomy or his storytelling or all these other things. He's like, that's not what it's about. It's about excitement. And he created excitement with those comics. And that's true. I wouldn't want to draw the way he draws, but as a kid, seeing that stuff, what Dustin said about it immediately registered with me. And it's like somebody complaining that like Kiss is not good rock and roll. It's like, you might be right, but those shows, the show is not like, they're not, like maybe Paul Stanley can't sing like Axl Rose, but there's something about the configuration of those people on stage. It gets people really excited. And at a certain time in their life. And then they can look back on those things with fondness. And I don't feel like it's a worthwhile thing to be rude about like pretty much anybody in our industry unless they've done something that on a human level is reprehensible. And as a kid, like, I'll always be grateful to Rob Liefeld for making me excited about comics, because that carried me through to now. So like those comics, I still have a soft spot for them. I love it. Dale Keown, I think that's how you say his name, drawing the Hulk. There's some issue he did of the Hulk where, I don't know, like the Starjammers or something have kidnapped him, and he's on their ship, and he's suspended by these crazy sci-fi cables, and he busts out, and he comes into the doorframe, and it's this big splash page of him. And I didn't understand how somebody could understand anatomy that well. I was like, this is amazing. Of course I'm 11, and when you draw ab muscles, they're all circles. So like that's what I thought. It's like, but he was doing this thing where he was capturing the way the light falls on rounded forms, and it blew my mind. And so there's those kind of comics they just stand out in my mind. And I've looked at them again, and they're not exactly what you think. But just like an adult, like if you go back to your childhood home, the things you remember, the scale may be not the same, but you'll notice details or aspects of the thing that you appreciate differently as an adult. And that's how I feel about those first comics I got.
I see. Okay, so you're working on this, what was the thing with the dogs again?
Oh, Beasts of Burden.
Beasts of Burden, yeah. So you're working on that, and what else is coming from you?
So my friend Terry Blass and Natalie Nuriga, who right now draws for Disney, we are collaborating on a project that's an all-ages project. We want to have out by next Emerald City in Seattle. And it's called Nettles the Witchicorn. It's about a little girl who got bit by a unicorn, and she's got magic powers, including a horn in the middle of her forehead. That is
It's a radioactive unicorn?
no, like we don't really get into that part of it, but like it's hard to say whether it's a thing that's about destiny or whether it's about being in the wrong place or right place at the right time. But we want it to be fun and magical and be a thing that if you were a kid, regardless of your gender or background, it'd be fun to read. And I think we can do that without falling into typical tropes and whatever else. So there's that. I've started writing my own series that I want to do at some point, and I'm not exactly sure what form it'll take. But I don't know, I always have little things percolating here and there. But the Nettles project with Terry and Natalie, that project is something that I'm actively taking steps to do. And then my own project, it may be a while until it comes out, but I'm really trying to pay attention to all the things that I care about in all of the media that I enjoy. What's good writing? What constitutes a character that somebody will care about? How do I make sure that I care about all my characters and not just front load my heroes with all the fun qualities? Make sure that it's a story that has clear implications for what happens if the characters don't meet their goals, or if what resistance they encounter, how is that germane to the emotional experiences they're having. I'm trying to pay attention to all this stuff, but then also just write what I think is fun and would be an interesting, cool looking story for people to read.
Check out Ben Dewey's work at bendewey.tumblr.com. Tell us what you think. Write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com, Twitter @deconcomics. Like our Facebook page or join our Facebook discussion group. Find all the links on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. We're also on YouTube, on the Comics Podcast Network at comicspodcasts.com, and on comicon.com, where our episodes appear a few days before they show up anywhere else. Also, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, iHeartRadio, or wherever you find podcasts. We really need more listeners to give us reviews and help us stand out from the many comics podcasts that are out there. Our theme is from bensound.com. This coming Thursday on To the Bat Polls, we dig into the draft script of the classic two-parter That Darn Catwoman and Scat Darn Catwoman. In the draft, Catwoman's protege is not Pussycat, but Poison Ivy. How different is the role from what was filmed? And what might have prompted the change? Also, what light does the draft shed on the idea that writer Stanley Ralph Ross might have given Robin less to do in this arc because Burt Ward was complaining about having too many lines? Look up To the Bat Polls wherever you find your podcasts, or at tothebatpoles.libsyn.com. Next week, the final installment of both my visit to Helioscope and the whole string of episodes from my summer trip, featuring Fred Chow, creator of Allison and Her Rock Awesome Robot, and Johnny Hiro, half Asian, all hero, and veteran artist Ron Randall, who's bringing back his 80s creator-owned series, Trekker. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.